what kind of stories are we looking for the Halifax Media Co-op? To start with, the obvious one, we're generally looking for stories that are situated in Halifax or the broader HRM, or also more broadly Nova Scotia. But generally, specifically, we're looking for stories that are somehow focused on Halifax.
We want stories that are underreported, so things that we're not seeing in the mainstream media.
We're looking for stories that are from the grassroots, and by grassroots we mean from the perspective or including the perspective of those directly affected by a policy and event.
So rather than top down, we'd rather see it being from the ground up.
From the ground up.
But we want stuff that's going on in our community, whether it be arts, music, sports, or anything that you think would be interesting. So it could be video, audio, or photo essay of what's going on around you.
So what makes a good grassroots story? Well, basically one thing that you have to think about when choosing a story is what's new about it, what's the hook, what's going to make people interested about that story today. So for example, snow in February is not an interesting story. Snow in June in Halifax or July is something that's kind of out of the ordinary and new, and is something that people might be interested in reading about. There also needs to be some tension though, and so to use the example from before, snow in June might reveal the fact that climate change is affecting the Atlantic provinces more. So there's a little bit of push and pull there. There's some kind of tension in the story that readers will want to know more about.
And an important thing to add to that is that you want to give context. So how many times has this happened before that it snowed in June? Is this the first time it's ever happened? Or you can talk about what's happening in other provinces across Canada, around the world. So you want to give context to, say, if we wanted to talk about climate change. You give folks a sense of situating the story in a time and place, and also what the repercussions of climate change are and have been. So you have your story idea, you've done your research, you're all set, now you need to interview people. Well, what do? Best thing is to make sure you know the person that you're about to interview. So read up on them and get to know your facts really well so that you can have an intelligent conversation with that person.
And you're going to want to plan your questions ahead of time. So like Vivian said, do your background research and have a list of questions. Although you might not stick to those questions specifically, it's good at least to have an idea of the kinds of questions and the kinds of information you need to get from that interview.
Absolutely, and even order is important too. So if it's a tough interview, say you're interviewing someone from the government and you have some tough questions to ask, you should usually leave those towards the end. At the beginning, it's nice to ask really kind of general questions, and don't be afraid to ask questions that are general. These are usually really helpful. You get a broad range of responses too when you do that.
Yeah, and you don't want to ask yes and no questions because that doesn't really give you much to go on. And also you want to avoid double-barreled questions. In other words, asking two questions at once. So why are you involved? When did you get involved, for example? You're probably going to get the person just answering one of those two questions, and you might forget about the other one.
And another thing, keep an open mind. If you're interviewing someone whose ideas you don't necessarily agree with, you don't need to be confrontational. You can just ask in a polite way.
Yeah, be respectful at all times. And I guess one other thing we should include is that you need to talk to people with different perspectives on the story you're talking about. You know, people from all sides, or as many sides as you can include. So, you know, the protagonist of the story, for example, you also might want to talk to researchers, talk to advocates. If it's an event you're covering, talking to the organizer of the event as well as some people who participated in the event, for example. It's a good idea if you can to interview, 2 or 3 people at least when you're writing a story.
It's good to get as many sides as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One thing that we often get asked about is bias at the Halifax Media Co-op. Aren't you concerned about not being objective? Aren't you concerned about being biased? Basically, our take on that is that it's pretty impossible not to have a bias. Everybody has opinions about things that they care about. So whenever you approach a story, whenever you choose to write a story, when you choose who to interview, each of those choices basically reveals a bias. So it's pretty impossible to avoid that.
There are things that you can do, obviously, if you're directly affiliated with a story because you're part of a group or association that's in the news. Then one thing that you can do is ask someone else to write that story who's further removed from it, or if you're writing that story, then disclose what your association is with that story so that folks who are reading it understand that there is going to be that, very obvious bias in that story. Okay. You could also consider writing something in a blog, and then that way you can freely express your opinions and the way that you see things without worrying, I guess, about
Conflict of interest.
Yeah.
So if you're out there and you're interested in contributing to the Halifax Media Co-op, we would definitely encourage you to do so. Basically, all you have to do is create a profile, and then you're good to go. You can post a blog, you can post an article, a photo essay. As long as you follow these guidelines, there's also more detailed guidelines that you can find on the site, and we'd encourage you to go for it.
And if you're having any problems, say going from story conception all the way to the end, you want some advice or some help, then feel free to contact people at the Media Co-op site, and there'll be people there to help you out.
There's contact information on the webpage. Yeah, and I guess last but not least, it would be great if you support what the Halifax Media Co-op is doing if you would become a sustainer. We're trying to get 50 sustainers in the first year, people who are contributing an average of $20 a month. And once we have that, we can start paying writers on a more regular basis and really going out and doing the investigative stories on important local issues that we need to see in Halifax. So please contribute, please support us, and thanks for watching.